welcome everybody to Agile Rhode Island's first virtual meetup at the Tech Collective. We've been so happy to have you here in our regular space, and we're excited about going virtual. In the last, in the last month and a half or so, so much has changed in our state, in our world. By nature, IT folks, IT professionals are fast, adapting and needing to learn, and continuous learners, lifelong learners even. In this kind of environment, though, it's really non-negotiable. We have to be continuing to learn and to try to improve our skill set. And the Tech Collective has adapted over the last couple of weeks. Virtual was always something we had planned. It was always something we thought we would have in our future. Like I said, the last few months have been really amping that up for us. And like 2 weeks ago, I think we might have had one virtual event, then 3. I think this week we have 6, and we're slowly getting ramped up. I don't think we'll have 40, but we found there's a couple of things. First of all, everybody is yearning for, connecting and learning from home. While people are alone at home and kind of trapped. As we've offered these sessions, there's 2 big things we've learned. First of all, the virtual attention span is not the same as when you drive somewhere to go to a meeting and you're willing to sit there for a couple of hours. We find that for many topics, an hour is about what's digestible at a time, especially during the workday. And so we're doing it. We're doing a lot of pop-up virtual meetings. Most of them are technical. A lot of them are soft skills or PD related as well. So we're trying to really fill in a lot of different needs. We'll be amping up what we're doing. I would suggest if you're looking for something to consume. Oh, and it's all free. We're not charging for any of these events right now. As we're switching over to virtual, we think it's important to try to get as much engagement as we can. And everything we're doing right now is for free. We're just trying to lean into the community. The second thing we've learned is lots of people come. Our sessions, like for example, we've moved from once a month to once a week CIO forums. We would sometimes get 15 to 20 CIOs visiting us for a cup of coffee in the morning once a month. If we did cocktails, sometimes we get 25 to 30, but we're well over 30 at almost all of our weekly meetings now. Our CIOs are coming and they're interested in, in connecting with each other, learning and connecting. So. The other thing that we're doing is we're leaning back into the community. We have 3 initiatives that we're working on, and I won't bore you with them, any details, but all the stuff's on our webpage if you want to check it out. Quickly, the 3 initiatives are, we have a Road to Resilience security program. We're helping small businesses with the cybersecurity. Many of your companies represented here today have security professionals that are helping us help people for free. We have worked out with Rhode Island Commerce and District Hall to provide free IT support for small businesses. So again, many of your folks at your companies are helping volunteer to provide free IT support, e-commerce development, building websites for these small businesses. And finally, we have a free laptop loaner program. Tech Collective is loaning our laptops to small businesses and nonprofits that need them. So any of those 3 programs kind of ringing a bell with you and you want to help out, let us know, or check our website for the calendar. We have a cyber event tomorrow and a data event on Thursday. There'll be more next week. A lot of things are happening with people coming together. So really appreciate you guys being here, and I would encourage you, this is an area that we'd like to do more with. The last thing I'll mention is these pop-ups are short in nature. We are finding that the speakers, and we have about 120 topics that we have to fill over the next few months with these 1-hour type pop-up meetings. A lot of them in cyber, a lot of them in data, and some interesting topics, maybe things you've already done that we could redo and maybe get a bigger audience, or some things you haven't done yet using the tools, or you'd be surprised. The topic doesn't have to be amazing to draw 30 or 40 people. We've had 60 to 70 most of the events we're doing. So anyway, that's all the commercial for Tech Collective. Thanks for being here. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask, and turn it back over to Doug, I guess.
Sure. And Joe, I see in the chat that's streaming along that several people are providing information about storytelling. So people, they were listening.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all. Appreciate that.
Yeah, people are collaborating, which is great. I'm sure Carissa will take some notes from Tech Collective. So I don't want to take up any time. I mean, this is Agile RI. So tonight we are lucky to have Doug Roerden to talk about how does Agile UX UI design fit in to Agile. And so I'm going to let him introduce himself and jump into his presentation. And again, there's chat in MS Teams, so feel free to hit the little chat button in that bar on the bottom if you mouse over it, and write down any questions as you think of them in the chat. So Doug Roerden, other Doug, are you ready to present?
I'm ready to present.
All right.
So, hello everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
And if everybody can just click the unmute button if you need to speak at this time, including me.
Well, so thank you everyone for coming out on a night like this. I hope your commute wasn't too bad. I hear there might be some thunderstorms. We had a little bit before. I'm Doug Roerden, and I am going to talk to you about how does UX UI fit into Agile. And I'll introduce myself a little more deeply in just a couple of minutes. I do want to thank our hosts, both Agile Rhode Island and the Rhode Island Tech Collective. Thanks to the founders for forming a great group like this. And thank you to Sue Harkin, who connected me with Agile Rhode Island. My goals for tonight, I hope, are the same as yours. Knowledge sharing, idea sharing, and hopefully people, including myself, leave with some valuable information or maybe some different ways of thinking about the challenges that we face. I will give a little bit of a spoiler here. I love this question because I get it all the time, and my standard response is the same as I'll give you now, is I'd like to reframe this question to how do we all work together? And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight. Here's our agenda. I'll tell you a little bit about that picture to the left in a moment. Actually, I'll tell you about that right now. So the title of this, how does UX UI fit into Agile, is well timed. The gentleman that you see is Tom Tullis. He's sometimes known as the father of usability. He's written several books about user experience, user interface. He's more on the quantitative side than the qualitative side. And he had these t-shirts made for a quant-qual smackdown that he did at a conference a couple of years back. But I just happened to come across the picture in my LinkedIn feed recently for two reasons I'm using it tonight. One is it's just perfect to see the AC/DC logo repurposed for UX UI. And Tom has COVID-19. He's in ICU right now. He's been there for about 3.5 weeks. Just want to send out some good thoughts to him. He's doing a little bit better. I just got news a few hours ago. He's going to be going to another hospital, still in ICU, but not quite as intensive. So we're hoping he's going to pull through. The agenda. I won't go through everything right now. I do want to point out it's basically some background, some history, and I say histories because there are multiple ones. I'll try not to make that too long, but it's sort of important to address what we're looking at now and in the future, and that's basically what the rest of the agenda entails. So, introductions, me first. I'm a musician. I went to school for music, actually, jazz composition and arranging. I'm a drummer. I got my start in software at a place called Coda Music Software. The company's gone through a few different names, but it has a program we came out with called Finale, which is basically where you can play something on a keyboard or a guitar as long as it's hooked up through the right interface, and Finale will notate that music for you. It's the premier product. It was probably $1,000 some 30 years ago. It's still going for about $600, and it's now on version 26. They have highly dominant market share, and pretty much anybody who works with written music is using Finale. So I spent a good part of my early career working for startups, always on the design or UX side, often called UI at the time, or a variety of other names. I worked for almost 15 years at Fidelity Investments, led groups in personal investing, workplace investing, institutional investing, asset management, pretty much all around the horn, even the global organization for a bit. And I'm presently at FM Global, where I head the experience design function there. We're a group of about 18 people, I guess 19 including myself. And I've been there about a year and a half now. And the company, as some of you may know, has gone through an agile transformation only in the last 2.5 years. And one can never say gone through, right? It's an evolution. It's something that's continuous. So we're still transforming. And then I live on a farm, which I throw in there because it's kind of interesting. And what's funny about it is I'm really a city boy. I happen to live on a farm, but I'm not really a farmer. My wife and kids and some of the rest of the family are the farmers, and we've got some twin baby sheep that are kind of cute, and all sorts of wonderful things happen around here. So what I'd like to do now is have you introduce yourselves, but in a really controlled way. I haven't used this for real yet, but I'm going to jump over to Mentimeter and hope that this works. So if you go to menti.com in whatever browser you'd like and use the code that's at the top of the screen there, I want you to then indicate what your affinity is. And what I mean by affinity is, you might say, gee, I'm an agile coach. Where do I fit? Well, you tell me. Do you think that's more design, business, or technology? There we go. So we're getting people in there. I think we have about 30 people, so I'll let this go for a bit. And actually, I can't see the lower corner here. There we go. This is sort of like a reverse sorting hat. You choose your affinity. Now we'll let the popcorn pop a little bit more, but a little more business than I expected. That's interesting. I thought we'd be technology heavy and design light. All right, so out of 23 people, we've got 39% tech. All right, about 25. 40-40-20. Okay, that's good to know. Well, so now that we know each other that much more intimately, I can dive into the rest of my presentation. That is helpful. I thank you very much. We were originally going to try that through the sidebar, and I'm glad we did it with technology. So this has already been covered, but if you do have some questions, please use the chat pane, and we'll address those. We will open up for question and answer at the end. Open up the mics and everything else. But certainly, if I'm losing anybody along the way, I want to address that for sure. So, has anybody ever heard of the term kleptomnesia? I read about it only a couple of months ago, and I really love it. It's basically when you accidentally...
Hey, Doug, I think we lost you. You're on mute.
Can't hear you.
Doug Roerden, nobody can hear you.
I keep on getting muted. Am I good now?
Yeah.
Okay. Where did you lose me?
after.
Right when you said you heard about it and you really liked kleptonesia. If you could start
Okay.
there.
All right. So kleptonesia is a term. Actually, right here, we'll just advance forward here. So Adam Grant is the author of Originals, a book that I highly recommend. I think he's the original. Who knows? He might have stolen this. But I first heard of kleptonesia from him, and he's being credited with the term. But I think this happens in history a bit too. Everybody says that Henry Ford was the person that said, if I asked people what they wanted, they'd say a faster horse and things like that. Apparently, Henry Ford didn't say that, but of course, he's the name that everybody remembers for the innovations that he brought to assembly lines, so he kind of gets the credit for it. I think my point mostly here is sometimes it doesn't matter so much exactly where an idea came from. It's just that we're using it. And sometimes it's kind of good if we don't remember that we think of it as our own. It means we've taken it on for ourselves. And I think that's really kind of an important thing. So here's a little test in kleptonesia. I don't expect anybody to actually write this down. We won't use the comment window or anything else for it, but it's kind of a which came first, chicken or egg, what belongs to what else. When you look at the terms down the center, just kind of quickly think, do I think that's more, did that come from Agile, or did that come from design thinking, or did it come from somewhere else? And are personas and user stories a part of collaboration or a part of Agile? Or just kind of give a little thought here. I'll leave a few moments so folks can give the list a good scan, but just get sort of a sense of how you would bucket things. Okay, everybody ready for the answers? So some of you may have put everything under the Agile category. Probably not. And some of you may have put everything under the design thinking category, including putting design thinking under the Agile category and putting Agile under the design thinking category. Probably most of us would put these things somewhere in between. There'd be a mix, somewhat of a hybrid. But I'm really trying to beat this horse to death a little bit about kleptonesia. I really want to set the stage for the history that we're about to look at. It's not so much about how precise it is. It's more just to get a general idea of the ideas that have been in play for a while. And that as we bring those together to figure out how to work together, we should be looking at which ideas and which concepts and which methodologies are going to work for us in a particular situation. So the short way to say that, we hear it all the time, is it depends. And I think that's a pretty accurate term. So I've gone with histories plural because we're going to look at a few things. I hope I don't go through this too quickly, but I also hope I don't take too long to get through it. It won't take us forever. I think we might more or less agree that within the software development world, and not just software, it goes beyond that, the biggies have been a waterfall process, lean, in my experience, just for a short while, but perhaps others have had more experience with lean development or pure lean development, and Agile, which we're talking about more tonight and these days. Within design, two things that sound extremely similar, and they're not that far apart, but there's user-centric design or user-centered design. You can use the words interchangeably. Human-centric design, again, similar but expands on it a little bit. And design thinking, which isn't exactly something entirely different, but it's much more encompassing than the first two. So I sort of appreciated this diagram. I'm sure if everybody in the room drew their own umbrella for what falls under Agile, we'd come up with some different things. So here we do see lean underneath Agile, and as I understand it, lean or lean Agile is a bit of a methodology. Extreme, Kanban. I've actually never heard of DSDM myself. Crystal I've probably heard of, but I don't really know what it is. And I think Scrum is what probably gets the most attention these days. So I really appreciated this umbrella just for myself to get a sense of how at least some people think of the Agile umbrella. There are several different ways of looking at UX UI as well, and I think this one resonates for me. I'm gonna build on this a little bit later in my presentation, but in my own experience, when I started at Coda Music Software, I was mostly being asked to do user interface design. So a few developers and a general manager and myself would get together for a little bit each day, throughout the day. We talk about the different challenges facing us, what we wanted to do with this program, and it was predominantly my job to figure out how we're going to display this to the user. For the most part, we were thinking of just our program, but because we had that keyboard or guitar or other instrument that was an input, we had to think a little bit broader than just what was on the screen. We had to think about what else was going on in our user's experience, but still focused on this digital experience they were having. That's UX design. And as you notice, the UX design bleeds a little bit into the non-digital world as well. That's because our experiences aren't purely digital, but the focus, of course, of software has been digital. I'll return to this later. So really quickly to go through those development, the development history. 1970 is when Winston Royce with Lockheed, I think it was, came up with, or at least codified, this waterfall process. Lean has a little bit more of a history. In 2003, I think, was the first paper, or maybe it was a book written on lean software development, but lean itself had been around for quite a bit longer. In the 1930s, Toyota was looking at lean and how they could apply it to manufacturing and business. And even earlier, some would say lean has its roots in the assembly line itself. There's even this idea that prior to Henry Ford and creating flow through an assembly line, Eli Whitney invented interchangeable parts, and that was a key part of lean, looking at eliminating waste in the process of manufacturing something. And there are even some who would go way back to the Venetian arsenal, so where ships were being built in sort of an assembly line process. So that was news to me only a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to introduce it here as well because it's kind of a deep history. Then we move on to Agile. The Snowbird meeting in Utah, I guess it was, where the Agile Manifesto came about, is widely known. I guess a year before, the same group, or almost the same group, met in Oregon, and that perhaps set things up for this historic meeting in 2001. I'm not sure rapid application development is all that related to Agile, but I think it's one of those methodologies that was looking for ways to do things better, because this application development crisis, as it was called in the 1990s, was where folks were realizing that there's a real lag here. There's about 3 years between the time we have a validated business need for something and we get an actual application in production. That's a long time. So thus the drive for something like Agile. Apparently ideas around Agile have been around since the 70s, and there are even some iterative and incremental approaches that have been in use since 1957. So again, a richer history than maybe many of us would have thought of. And even back to the 1930s, I've got to look at this now. A guy at Bell Labs, Walter Schuhart, had this thing called Plan, Do, Study, and Act, and it was basically to improve cyclically, production or manufacturing of something. One more. Some would even say, back at the time the Pilgrims were landing at Plymouth Rock, that Francis Bacon's articulation of the scientific method is really the start of Agile. That might be a little too much of a stretch. Is there a question? No? Okay. So more histories. We're going to cover the design column now. The user-centric design or user-centered design was a term that Don Norman of Nielsen Norman Group, but Don Norman's a deep and well-respected design leader and thought leader, He actually reformed something that's called participatory design into this user-centric or user-centered design, which is really just what it says. It's putting the user of something, technology in most cases, in the center of the design and development process. So really similarly named, about 4 years later, this idea of human-centered design came about, and that is the goal of humanizing the design process, so supporting user-centric design, while also empathizing with the stakeholders. Now, I've been in plenty of conversations, and maybe you have too, where, gosh, designers, that's a really great idea you have. We really like that, but we're the business. We have to pay for this thing. There's just no way we can do that feasibly. So human-centric design was a way of making sure that we're not leaving business stakeholders or other stakeholders out of things. And design thinking is something that only about 15 years ago reached widespread adoption. It follows a framework, and I think framework is the key word to use there. And so a lot of people think that design thinking is just, all right, we're going to approach this the way a designer would. And in a sense, that's true, but it's not that simple. The framework is really key. And the framework is essentially, first off, you need to gain empathy with your customer. I'll use that word customer loosely. You need to define the problem that they're experiencing in their terms. So it's usually a hypothesis. You then ideate around ways to approach that problem. You prototype something you can test. That doesn't mean code necessarily. It could be a paper prototype. It could be something physical. And then you test that. It could even be an interaction, like a conversation. And it's not exactly a cycle that you go around like a game board over and over again, but at each stage, when you learn something where you need to go back to an earlier stage to find out, to go a little bit deeper. So let's say you hit your ideation stage and you realize, wow, I don't think, we've got all these ideas, but maybe our hypothesis isn't quite right, or we actually need to get a little more touch with our customers. You go back to an earlier point in the cycle. Where that usually comes out is once you prototype something, you're testing it, you realize, oh, okay, we either didn't prototype it right or any one of the other steps beforehand. So I won't go too much into this because I'm feeling, even though I can't see you all, I'm getting the boring history class session going. But there's a history as well where a number of people were looking at wicked problems, so addressing problems. I think I will call out the 1960s. In the US, there was something called design science going on. So it was an attempt to scientize design, and a similar effort in Scandinavia called cooperative design, which again is just like it sounds. And the two are rather similar. And Buckminster Fuller in the 1950s really kind of spearheaded a lot of the thinking around this. He created some design teams. So think about this. This is the 1950s, and he was putting together teams that were of experts across disciplines to look at systemic failures. So it wasn't, oh, okay, this is a, this kind of technical, this is a mechanical engineering issue. Let's get the mechanical engineer in. It was abstracting another layer and looking at things across competencies or practices. So that's the 50s, design science, and a book, or maybe it was an article written by John Dewey in 1935 called Wicked Problems is what was the impetus for a lot of this. And it really, really goes back to way earlier, Plato's Republic. That some of the Greek philosophers had come up with this idea of participatory design. So Plato was known to seek advice from people, and grassroots democracy is seen coming from participatory methodology or participatory design. And it's basically a style of collaboration that's been used to help develop harmonious societies. So kind of put that in the back of your mind, that harmonious societies, because we're going to tap into that a little bit later in yet another way. All right. I think this is the last history I'm going to hit you with here. It's servant leadership. I'm a big proponent of it. It's basically a management style that puts employees and their needs first, or in some cases it might be customers and their needs before employees. before the manager. It's basically a life cycle. And the concept comes, I'll go one more here. In 1970, Robert Greenleaf, who was an executive at AT&T in the 40s through 60s, I think it was, came up with the servant as leader idea. And it was built upon 2 or 3 influences. So believe it or not, Hillary Clinton's commencement address at Wellesley was a key impetus for his servant as leader thinking, as was Hermann Hesse's book, Journey to the East, which I think was, 1932. And as I've spoiled here, we'll get back to the Greek philosophers in a little bit as well. But let me jump back up to the very top. I've only recently been exposed to the 10 characteristics of servant leadership, and in a little bit, I'll show you how those play together. I only heard of this maybe 2 years ago. It's about 10 years old, and I think for a lot of people, including myself, servant leadership itself is only about 10 years old at most. It may be new to some of you tonight, but again, it goes way back to these same Greek philosophers, and even some say back to Tao Te Ching in the 5th century BC. I won't go any more into that, just to let you know it goes way back. So when we're talking about this 10 characteristics, and this will play in, don't worry, it's really about one key characteristic. The goal of servant leadership is to build community. So if you think about your Agile team, perhaps, it's building community among that team so that you can work more harmoniously together. If you think about the customers that you're serving, you're trying to build community in a relationship with them so that you can serve them better with your products or your services. On and on, you can come up with the examples. At the other end of the spectrum, there are 3 foundational characteristics that come into play. And the first one is listening, or active listening. So if you're not listening, you can't be learning. And if you're not listening, you can't develop empathy for your employee, your customer, your patient, whomever it might be. If you don't have empathy for your customer, you can't heal what ails them. Now, healing does not need to mean, in a medical sense here. It could be healing the problems that they're having in their business. It could be the problems that come out on a journey map of a process that people are trying to work through, either with or without software. And then the other 6 characteristics are all wonderful, important as well, but they kind of pale in comparison to this goal of building community and those 3 building blocks to get there. Now, those 3 building blocks are really key in design thinking and in design in general. So if you're not listening, you can't develop empathy. Empathy is the core or the beginning of a design thinking framework. And from that empathy, you are trying to heal what is going on, the problems for your user through their lens, that hypothesis or definition from their framework, as well as ideating solutions around that. So I think the history lesson is now over. Thank you for bearing with me in that. It's all background that we're going to be using here. So this might look like a little bit more of a history lesson, but it's not. So if we think about tonight in sort of a what, so what, and now what framework, I just covered a bit of the what in the background. And I think the so what I'd say is we've come a really long way from a nomadic culture through into certainly the information age, and now we're entering, if we're not already in this conceptual age. Now, I'm sure other terms are going to be used for it over time. Some people call it the artificial intelligence age. Conceptual seems to be the one that's ringing through for the most part. But now that we're in this conceptual age, it's kind of interesting to note we've gotten here pretty quickly, a lot quicker than we went through any of the preceding cycles. So you kind of wonder what's ahead. But the thing that I notice happening, and you may not agree with this, is we still have predominantly an industrial age approach to things. I'm sure most people will think of the waterfall process as kind of an industrial age sequential assembly line kind of a process. And whether we're talking about Agile or something else, I think it's hard to say that collectively, everyone, business, design, technology, the way we do things has fully embraced even the information age, much less entered the conceptual age. Our practices are very much industrial, and I think sometimes we might hear that from some of our leaders in the companies we work for in terms of, not quite understanding how this agile thing's really going to work for this. And another great presentation might be how does agile fit into our industrial age mindset? I think a lot of us are dealing with that every day, whether we realize it or not. I'm trying to think right now, one of the silver linings of this coronavirus disruption that we can hope for a move away from some of the industrial age mindsets that had had such a strong influence and a hold on us as we're entering this conceptual age. I'm not thinking it's a panacea that's going to fix it all, but there can be some good that comes out of this, and I'm sure some of you are thinking the same. So I usually talk about raising the bar, but when you look at a bell curve, that sounds like we're just trying to make the middle higher. So I'm saying it's time to improve the curve. And what do I mean by that? Well, I see that whether it's Agile or anything else, when we put all of our focus on the process, we're putting ourselves in an industrial age mindset. And that's the end of the curve that doesn't tend to work out so well, at least in my observation. In the middle part of the curve, it's where we've really adapted that Agile mindset. And I'm totally for adopting an Agile mindset. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm thinking there's something, and it's really, in a sense, it's just the wording, but it's also the concept. I'm thinking that word framework is even a little bit more freeing. And I'm playing around with this. Feel free to play around with it with me if you like the idea. But I keep finding the word mindset is bothering me, and it's because of the word set. If we're going to be open to things, then how can we have a mindset? That means we've set our mind to something, doesn't it? Or at least sounds like that. Whereas if we have a framework, it's a little bit more open, and we can adapt a little bit better to the it depends part of things, to the variables that are going to come into a problem. And I think we'll be a little bit more agile in that sense. So I like to bring that out there and say, I think in the progression we're all on together, we need to work toward, whether we call it a mindset or not, something that really is more of a framework, and certainly not a rigid process. Probably what we do call a mindset, but I sort of like the framework word a little better, and I'm gonna be pushing it in my circles. So here we're going to get to some of the answers that maybe some of you came for, and I think all of these ideas have a lot of good characteristics to them, and this would be now in the now what sort of phase of things. So there are probably many more ideas than what I'll show tonight, but as we literally look for how does design fit into Agile, one way is this idea of sprint zero, where the team, certainly designers usually lead this, will go about discovery activities and finding what it is from a user sense that we want to bring into perhaps one of two tracks. The dual track idea I'll get into a little bit more later. This diagram that we're looking at doesn't necessarily need to break into tracks, but it's the idea of before we start developing, we've got to have some idea of what we're doing. I think the idea of sprint zero goes far beyond just design. It's in setting up a team as well. But it's to keep that ongoing momentum of we need to discover and figure out what we really want to atomize and break up and chunk out into developmental bits and pieces before we can just go at building something. So that's one idea. Google has this idea of a design sprint, and you might think it sounds like sprint zero again, but what they're really trying to do is absolutely shortcut this idea of going to build and launch before you learn. So it's like a rapid 1 week process to go from an idea to learning something about it. And it looks a lot, at least toward the end, like design thinking. in the map and asking the experts. Maybe there's some gaining of empathy here. There's got to be some kind of definition before you're sketching. Some decisions are made on what to prototype, and of course you test it. That's another thought, and that comes from Google. And then, yeah, this is the one that more or less gets my vote overall. But again, I've really got to say it depends. I heard somebody in the networking at the beginning saying they're working at something, and the organization isn't necessarily fully agile now. And in fact, the thing that he's working on doesn't necessarily need agile either. So I think that's fine. I think it's great if people are thinking through critically, what are the tools we want to bring? What's the framework or the mindset that we want to bring to the problem or the product or the service that we have at hand? But I would say that in my experience, certainly at Fidelity and now at FM Global, the dual track idea seems to me to be the best fit for most situations. So again, you saw it on the Sprint Zero slide, but it's that idea of there's a constant evolutionary discovery going on at the same time as a constant evolutionary delivery. The two feed each other. And I probably have a few too many diagrams of this, but there are a few nice ways of looking at this that introduce some other thoughts and things that might happen along the way. So you can be doing paper prototyping MVPs within a discovery phase, rather than waiting until you've got code that maybe earlier you would have thought about putting into production, or you'd be building up for a year to eventually give the big reveal in production after some user acceptance testing or something like that. This is keeping that iteration and testing earlier and getting an MVP out even in a discovery phase. This one I kind of like. I'd rather see it on its side so that the two tracks are showing more in the same timeline. But the point here is, let's just separate our problem and solution space. That discovery area in dual track is dealing with problems and reframing them as they come into the solution space. So again, I see a lot of design thinking throughout this: understand, define, ideate, prototype, and test. It's pretty much the same general idea. I probably have one or two more examples of this. I pulled out this one for one reason only. I really liked that each of these discovery phases has different sizes to it, and there's a small circle and a medium circle here before two big circles, and then three small circles. It's not a one size fits all. Not everything is going to fit so neatly into exactly the same way of approaching it each time. The whole key is, what are the opportunities or the problems that we're trying to solve, and what can we learn from them so that we're bringing forth our best ideas into the space of what we're going to actually develop and deliver. And still, there's that beautiful wording of potentially shippable software. We just aren't dumping these things out on our customers. And here is likely my favorite. Gartner has popularized this. It's where design thinking, lean startup, so I think of that as mostly a business framework, and agile are all working together. Kleptonesia for sure here, or chicken and egg as well. We very much practice this in some areas at Fidelity over the last 10 years, actually. And in my memory, we invented it, but clearly we didn't, because, Gartner came out with this as well. And I think it's just one of those things where people are looking for what's going to work for us. Let's answer that "it depends" question in this case. And in most cases, we're finding that leading with design thinking, getting into a lean startup mode with our mostly with our stakeholders, and then bringing things into an agile development process was sort of the sweet spot that mostly worked for folks. Now, there are a dozen different ways to do agile for sure. There are probably a dozen different ways to do lean. There are certainly a dozen, I'm saying a dozen, it's infinite really, different ways of doing design thinking as well. So this is a pretty broad framework, but it's again dealing with discovery and delivery, or abstract and concrete problems and solutions. And I think it's a pretty good map to look at. So remember that diagram from earlier where we just saw UI and UX, and certainly that's the title of this talk tonight. Well, there's a little bit more going on, and this is just one viewpoint of things. It resonates pretty well with me because it's what I've seen. Being in UX design and working with other UX designers and other people outside of design, what I've seen is this yearning for a more holistic picture constantly. And that usually brings us more into the analog or non-digital world. So CX design or customer experience design, in my experience, has two different roots. One of them is the customer support model where a bank has branches and an investment company has a telephone support line. And there's all that customer experience that happens for people, for the most part, devoid of technology, or maybe it's using technology in complement, but it's person to person, voice to voice over the phone, in person in a branch, something like that. The other part of CX design is, I think more the way I've experienced it, is where UX designers are looking for more of that experience to consider. So it's not just the music software that we're developing or even the input module, but it's the paper that that most musicians are going to use to take down notes or write down chord changes, or it's the piano that's not even hooked up to the music system. Or in every industry, you can just keep on thinking of more and more things. And when you really broaden that out, don't try and read the full definitions here, but it's basically getting to this even larger sphere that a lot of people are calling service design, is where you're looking at all of the capabilities. You're looking at the people, the infrastructure, communication, procedures, materials. You're looking at everything you could possibly look at. So yeah, you're boiling the ocean. You're looking at the ocean. You're not boiling it, but you're looking at it to figure out what's really going to make a difference here and which parts of this ocean should we boil before we're down at a deeper level in this structure. And then I sort of add this degree of impact that I found designers can have. There is impact at the UI design level. It's relatively low. At that level, we can absolutely help to come out with something that's going to be usable, meaning user-friendly, I think is a term a lot of people use. If we're somewhere in the middle of that and incorporating UX design or perhaps some CX design, we're able to help come up with something that's useful, not just usable. So it really is going to make a difference for the people using it. And obviously, if we're all looking at the ocean, we can come up with something transformational. That's a bigger nut to crack for sure. All right. I mentioned diversity and inclusion in the description for this talk. This is not more history, but I think there are 35 or 36, roughly 36 different characteristics or different types of diversity. There are probably more than this. I mean, there's probably every kind of diversity you could possibly think of. But when I brought up this list, I was a little surprised. There were some things I hadn't thought of. Obviously, there are some really common ones that we all talk about very often. And I think in looking at ways to work together, we really want to look at, and I deliberately said round pegs and square holes, but we need to look at how the square pegs fit the round holes as well, and every other shape fitting every other shape. And this gets again to that whole it depends sort of an issue. So when we're looking at how does UX UI fit within Agile, and how I say, let's look more at how we all work together. I say that because believe it or not, one of the thoughts that came to my mind is, if we're saying how does UX UI fit into Agile, is that different than saying how do we fit women into the workplace, or integrate blacks into schools, or Macs into a Windows environment? I mean, you can go on with this, and I'm not looking to be ultra provocative here, but I think it's helpful to say, let's really look at the big picture of what we're talking about, and let's find the ways to collectively work together, because if we're not utilizing each other's strengths, then we're not going to be the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And I think what's interesting is most organizations I've been a part of are and I was showing my bias at the beginning, are largely technology based. So we've got about, out of the, I think 30 people on the call, 25 responded. It came up to 40% business affinity. Doesn't mean you literally work in business. 40% technology and 20% design. I was surprised to see business as high as technology in this group, and pleasantly surprised at that. But I think that what tends to happen is the largest group might be the one that is the host that perhaps has the greatest risk of rejecting a new organ, let's say. But the opposite actually holds true, and I've heard stories of this. I just haven't experienced it myself. I can't say quite to this degree. I think of the big design agencies that are out there, and at a certain point, they were embracing technology. And I think that technologists had a similar experience. You know, you're the first one and only system admin within a design agency. You know, you really are the diverse, you're the diversity candidate in that group. And so we should all look at the inclusion that we really need to figure out how to work together. So back to that, you know, the 40-40-20 representation that we have here. I think I've already probably made clear the attitude adjustment I'm looking for us to have. So it's a reframing of this problem or issue or challenge that we have, and it's a fantastic challenge. And I'm more or less a proponent of, let's try and combine those things that, in my experience and from what I've seen, have been the most impactful in these three different basic areas. And yep, there are other bubbles here. There are probably ways of wrapping all this together, or you know, sub bubbles and all the rest. But in a real broad stroke, this is the world I find myself living in. And let's look to give each of these different practices or affinities a seat at the table, so to speak. And let's try and do that thinking of servant leadership all the time. So what is it that I in design can do for you in technology and for you in business? And likewise, if you're thinking the same, and then we're all thinking of what can we do for our constituents, be they senior management or our clients or employees or whatever it might be, I think we'll go a long way to dealing with the holistic and breaking it down into an atomic sense that makes sense for a regular and iterative development cycle. The biggest example I've seen of this happening, so at huge scale, and I'm sure most of you know the story, is Ginny Rometty, I think she's now the former CEO of IBM, probably 5, certainly not 10, but somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, addressed the entire company in an all hands and said, our future is the combination of design thinking and agile. And I think what IBM has done to bring those two together and figure out for them, how does this work? They've come up with their own kind of a framework. It's symbolized by the infinity symbol. I think they even call it the infinity, no, I forget what it's called. I'm sorry, but you can easily look it up. All right, it might be missing the lean startup part, and maybe in IBM's practice, that's what they're working with business consultants and their clients on. But I thought it was a fantastic statement, and I know IBM's done very well as a part of it, and it's kind of a bringing chocolate and peanut butter together situation. So that's what I had to share. I would love to open up the mics now and open up for questions and reframing. So it might not be answers that I have or somebody else has, but I'd love to open up with the first question and ask folks in the audience, how does it fit for you in your organization? I mean, I've heard the term Scrumban. Are we going to come up with lean design thinking? You know, what's working in the organizations that you work in, whether you're a consultant or an employee or a manager or whatever?
So the other Doug asked a question. Well, that's not a real question. Somebody else have a question?
No question.
I did.
How about some comments?
So I just threw in a question. I worked with a team years ago that was developing websites, and they would have these staggered sprints. So somebody would sketch something out and design it, and then you go into a code development sprint. And often the developers would then find some difference where, they're developing something and say, oh, it'd be a lot easier if we changed the design. And, they'd be out of sync then. And then you'd have, somebody saying, well, now we'll never be able to finish in this sprint. So what's your experience maybe with working with teams like that?
Yeah, I think that happens all the time. And I guess my experience, so time is certainly a critical factor, and we do time box things. I think if a team is truly agile and working together, that the psychological safety and trust that exists on the team is going to be able to raise those issues quickly. I think developers should certainly be a part of the design process as well. So it's not this throw it over the wall. That to me shouldn't happen anymore at all. Even if you're working in waterfall, that should not happen. There's opportunity to work collectively and know what each other are doing. If you're doing dual track agile, it's not like the designers are in the discovery track and the developers are in the delivery track. We still have to work together as a team, and I would think, certainly working from sketches and a developer saying, well, it would be easier to do this, whether it's for a technical reason or because they see something in the design. I think, great, let's sketch that up and code that. Anybody want to answer my question? How are your organizations working? I'm really dying to know. Nobody.
So I've seen some people pivot, and maybe sometimes it's been, too far one way and then too far the other, where they started with, we're going to have a wireframe or, a full-on layout, not even a wireframe, where the button is here and it's this size and it's exactly all laid out, and all the developer does is come in and sort of code to fit. And then they went to the opposite end where, they tried to do more behavior-driven design, where it was just the idea. Like a user needs to log in, build it, without kind of designing anything from a user, kind of UX perspective. So where do you see a best practice kind of there? Letting people be wide open and work together, concurrently, or?
Yeah, that's a big yes for me, or an it depends as well. Honestly, it really does depend on the situation and the team. I've seen both. I've experienced both. I've seen both work well, and I've seen both fail as well. There are situations I've seen where someone on the UX side is able to code at a level beyond a prototype, and they're able to come up with production level code for the UI, and that if they're working in that environment in tandem with other developers working on the rest of the system, then you're kind of all playing in the same sandbox, and you get away from even the, I think you should probably always start with a sketch, whether it's on a whiteboard or a piece of paper or something more formal, because it's a little bit quicker than code. But at a certain point, everything is throwaway except for code. So let's work in that precious code together so that we can come up with the best end result, because the best end result is going to live in code. But I think that can happen both ways. It can be, sketch to code. It can be designer working in code, and anywhere in between.
So some people think you should work in a quick, sort of mock way, and other people think don't waste your time, just code it in the tool that you're going to build it in from scratch? Do you have an opinion, or is that, again, it depends? And that's probably from the base camp folks who say code it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does. So I wouldn't say it depends to that in my experience of the kinds of things I work on. I imagine there are cases where that could make sense. Maybe it's partly dependent on the size of the team or what it is that's being built. But that three-legged stool, that design business technology picture, I've worked in cases where it's been 3 people, each representing one of those practices, let's say, or more than one person. And it's almost always been best for us to together sketch something. It could be 5 minutes, it could be a half an hour, it could be a day on a whiteboard, or an evolutionary whiteboard that's sitting there that folks are working off of, a digital whiteboard through all the tools we have, digital Post-it notes and the rest of it, and that there can be this living, breathing sketch area that isn't as involved and as precious as the code. So I guess it does depend. It's like, where is that critical mass of where, wow, we're investing so much in the code. Wouldn't it be better if we just sketch some of this out first, versus we're spending too much time sketching, we're never getting anything into code. So I think it's a dial or a spectrum.
I was wondering if this is a good idea to talk about when you are kicking off the projects as part of definition of ready. And we often go through this when we kick off a project, and what is our definition of ready? Sometimes people say we want at least like a wireframe design ready so that I can start my work. Others say, okay, we're gonna do it truly agile, we'll do it together throughout sprints. And it starts with like maybe whiteboard drawing at the beginning of the sprint while everybody's working on their part. The designer goes and does the more advanced high fidelity screenshots using more advanced tools, and this goes hand in hand.
I love that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So defining that definition of ready, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Doug, I have a question. This is Barbara. What would you say, or what kind of challenges do you see when the company or the organization, or just to say the product, is a Salesforce product or a CRM product or something that is more out of the box and they're limited in their ability to really customize the user experience?
Yep. Yeah, great question. So there are a lot of packaged products that there might be some configuration. Perhaps it's just names of labels that you can configure. I found that there is value in having someone astute at research, measurement, and testing. A UX researcher, to do some actual testing of that out-of-the-box application, the instance of it, with the actual users, so that you can figure out where the problems still lie. I think if you don't know where the problems are or what the problems are, then you're really in trouble because you're just guessing. At least if you know them, there are cases where you can configure something to address the problem, or at least you've got some really good information going into training that you might need for such a platform. I find there are some cases where you can actually go back to the Salesforce or whomever it is and perhaps get a feature. It's usually months, if not years down the road, incorporated into their platform, because people are going to be able to make better use of it. I'm trying to get a hold of the people at Workday at this point, because I'm seeing some areas for improvement that I'd love to share with them. Maybe it's news to them, maybe it's not. Maybe they can do something about it, maybe they can't, or maybe it's not worth their while. But I figure it's worth the time.
Sure, that's a really good point. Giving feedback even to the people who are supposedly doing it correct and have done their own user research, right? But
yeah. I mean, I happen to know Salesforce has a tremendous, Salesforce in particular, has a tremendous design group. They adhere to a wonderful set of design principles that are, you know, akin to Disney's service principles, and really, really rock solid work that comes out of there. But obviously, that's a platform that people are trying to apply in tens of thousands of different ways, if not more.
Yeah, a lot of us use Jira for managing projects, and they're very transparent about asking for feedback, and certainly they make some changes, but my description of their product is like somebody bought a beach house and over 10 years built it into a mansion and forgot to, you know, tear it down first. And it's inconsistent interfaces. It's all over the place.
Ouch.
Yeah. But, you know, it's become a standard because people keep using it, and it's tied into a lot of other systems.
And it's hard to change. Yeah.
so if there are no other questions, Doug, did you have another poll or anything else that you wanted to do to wrap up?
No, I think it was really, I guess it's, I don't need the poll on it, but I would love to get a sense if anybody wants to share. I'm trying to find in my notes the questions that I had. It's really, do you think I'm on point, and are you with me? Like, does this sound like the way to go at things? Let's figure out how to work together. Yeah, just that. So if anybody wants to share, that would be great.
Yeah, question about moving from where you had the timeline starting as nomads, but really moving the industrial, informational, and conceptual. How do you kind of differentiate between the informational and conceptual, I guess?
Yeah, really good question. So I think of it mostly in terms of AI. I think that, but there's more to it than that. I mean, I guess I'd characterize the information age as, you know, the internet has been the great many-to-many democratization of information, or that's part of its intent. I know that, you know, there are still the big companies that kind of, it seems, sometimes own the internet, or certainly steer it as well. But I think the exchange of information has been a bit more democratized. I think if you think of that going beyond just, you know, words and numbers and transactions, and into the realm of experiences and relationships, and what we're seeing and can barely even dream of coming upon us in terms of technology, I think that's this conceptual idea. It's almost like whatever you can dream of can kind of become a reality in some way. We used to always talk about that story. So as a designer, I'd get into trouble, or people in my group would get into trouble, because they'd come up with this beautiful vision of something and show it to the business, and the business loves it, and they throw $1 million at it, and a year later it wasn't built, or it was built not quite to what that original dream was. And we used to talk about it, you know, that we're putting wings on cars, or we're making flying cars, and it was just such a laughable thing, because of course you can't have a flying car. But of course now we actually do have flying cars, and perhaps someday, I don't know if it's sooner or later, it'll be a common thing to have something like a flying car, and it won't be as big of a deal, as long as we're over COVID-19, to go from one place to another without an airport, without the long lines, and all of that kind of a thing. So I think that's all part of this conceptual idea. If you can dream it, we can do it.
So maybe going from more that just receiving from the internet and publishing one way, more of an interactive type product, at least from the information, internet experience.
Yeah, and certainly beyond the internet as well. Yeah.
Right, Rajesh here.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. Actually, I have a question regarding the prototype design using paper-based concept, right? So that is a good thought, but if you are making any changes while explanation to the business stakeholders, so how it is so effective, because we are currently in the digital world we are talking about and we are using a paper-based design, how the changes will impact and what is the best method?
So the way I've mostly used paper prototypes is to more quickly than you can. So obviously there are quick ways of doing code. People have done prototypes to simulate a computer program in PowerPoint, for example. You can certainly do that in a digital environment, but the times I've used paper prototypes have been even scrappier and quicker. So when I was at Fidelity, for example, we would often have what we call cafe studies. Everybody comes through the cafeteria at noon, and it was a great way to capture employees at least and get general ideas for how something was working. So whether we took Post-it notes to represent a mobile phone, and obviously there's a certain size Post-it note that really represents itself well, or a larger piece of paper to represent perhaps a laptop screen, we were able to sketch and resketch and erase and elicit feedback from that user for putting something in front of them, giving them a task to do and saying, how would you go about doing this? And they're touching different parts of it and saying, well, I think I'd click here for more information. Oh, and what would you expect there? And they tell you what they'd expect, and then you can actually quickly draw that. So it's almost as if you're producing what they're talking about live and through sketching. So it wasn't so much to have things live on paper that were going to actually be designed, and that there was a grand process involved to somehow take pictures of those to share with stakeholders. It was more a part of the process where, all right, the next phase then would be something a little bit more formal and digital, where you use Sketch or some other software to come up with an interface that represented what you learned from all of those paper prototype tests that you did. Or you might even go right to code. And then you've got a situation where, all right, you're sitting down with or teleconferencing with your stakeholders, and you're able to show them not just what you came up with, but also you can tell them why. Well, 9 out of the 10 users that we walk through this had a hard time with this term, and they couldn't find the search box because it wasn't in the upper right, which is where everybody expects it. It was in the lower left, and they never saw it, and on and on and on. So you have a really good story that goes along with where you've landed. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, good. I love paper prototyping.
Can you talk briefly about like the concept of MVP and how designers look at that? Do they think the M of MVP is too minimal, that it's not even worth doing, and you should have a full product that's going to be functional?
So there may be some designers who think that, and I may have been one of them at one point in my life, but I think very differently now. So I think I was saying earlier when we looked at this slide, hey, take a look. There are 4 MVP tests kind of illustrated there at the very beginning of the discovery phase. Isn't that kind of cool? And to my thinking, that could easily be a paper prototype. So if you subscribe to the concept that a paper prototype can be a minimally viable product, then you're maybe in some really good shape for learning an awful lot very early. And okay, perhaps the first MVP that you're going to have in code going to the market might be this orange dot right here. But look at all that you would have learned in a small and incremental way long before you're bringing that code to your users.
And that's from having a different view of what an MVP is, right? An MVP, at least as described in Lean Startup, is the smallest thing you need to test a hypothesis. So it's not the smallest thing that we can put into production.
Exactly. And I think that's why I subscribe to this idea. Like it is to test a hypothesis. Obviously, MVP has become, what can we put into production in a lot of places. So I think that's what I don't remember the complete story behind this particular article, but I think that's some of what's being illustrated here is both MVPs. It's funny, that's another kleptonesia thing. So you quoted that the way I remember it, that MVP is a lean startup concept, and I would credit Eric Ries with it. Maybe it came before him, but I've heard people talk about MVP as, oh, well, that comes from design thinking, or that comes from Agile. And it's like, well, who really cares where it came from? Are we using it, or are we using it the way we should be using it?
Right. Or at least a way that's useful.
Even better. Yeah. Even better.
Okay, well, Doug, I always appreciate your presentations. I think the questions have just about dried up. We would appreciate any feedback that you have on how we did. We want to thank you from Agile Rhode Island. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, everyone who attended tonight. I just wanted to quickly announce for next month's meeting, May 19th, so third Tuesday of every month, we'll continue to do this virtually. And we have Dorothy Abote from Mountain Willow Strategic Solutions, and she's going to talk about the enhancement of engagement and effectiveness of remote teams. So please join us for that. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, if you want to join us for a lean coffee on Wednesdays at noon Eastern Standard Time, we will be there. The link is up in this chain. And if you do have any feedback for us, please, go ahead and just put it on our, I think our Agile Rhode Island LinkedIn site would be good, or leave it here. Either way, but that would be great. I'm actually chatting with some of the other co-founders and trying to find out, does anybody know, is our email available? Or
Crusoe from Tech Collective, are you on to talk? Do you have an email you want to give up?
Or you can just email agile@gmail.com.
Yeah, I
yes,
was going to say Agile.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. Excellent. Do you want to put it on the chat box as well?
I am doing it right now.
Fine.
That will be for feedback. And again, so thank you so much. I don't know if anybody does have any other questions, maybe Doug will hang out for another minute or two. You can wrap it up. And that's all we had for tonight. Thank you so much. Please leave feedback. And we'll see you soon.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Remember to cook on. Kleptonesia, yes.
Oh, by the way, Doug, kleptonesia, that was my idea,
Of course it was.
Nice. I like that, though. I'm going to use it.
Yeah.
Exactly. No
Isn't
pun
it fun?
intended.
It's a term you want to use. It's sort of a meta thing.
Sure. No, I like it.
Yeah, I actually Googled it. It shows up in a whole bunch of websites. And with various origins. So
Right.
it's great that the term itself has multiple origins.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. It's only so accurate you can get with the source of anything, especially now.
Yeah. Meta.
That was a great session, Doug.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. No, thank you. That was fun.
It was.
Thanks, Doug Roerden.
It's kind of sad that I won't be able to see you present at, FM Global anymore. but at least I get this one.
Come on back as a visitor. We got teams. We'll invite you.
Oh, I don't know. You know, once you leave, you're kind of like I don't know. You're that person that left.